Speaking of being frank and direct and getting answers, I want you to answer this for me, Joe.
Oh, jeez.
Please tell me, Joe, what the fuck am I looking at right here?
Ladies and gentlemen, anytime you see fighters in this position, Sean Ross Sapp will lose his freaking marbles because the rage, the blood pressure, the boiling point of Sean Ross Sapp is when anybody decides to hang on to a guillotine with their opponent on the ground that ends up in side control, and they remain in that position and they hold it. To make things absolutely worse, there's probably two things that can make it absolutely worse. A, if it's an opponent of OSP and they remain in that position, knowing OSP will strangle you to sleep. B, if it's a former opponent of OSP that still hasn't learned his lesson. And
I was ready to let it go, Joe. After all that Krylov has done since then, I was ready to let it go. Even if he had lost this fight, I was ready to let it go. Because I always say it, Joe. How seriously can I take a guy who gets tapped by a Flue Choke? How seriously can I take a guy that held on to a guillotine while OSP had him inside? Now, since then, I said this on the recap, since then, OSP has perfected it to where if you give him an inch, he takes a mile. That was not the case in 2014 when Krylov did this, Joe. Krylov held on to it for like 40 seconds back then. And he does it again here. For some reason, Blachowicz didn't capitalize on it. It didn't much matter because he mollywopped Nikita Krylov on the ground. Who are the people that Nikita Krylov has been training with since March 15th, 2014? Because this has happened in training. There's no way it hasn't. If it happened in this fight, there's no way that 4.5 years later, after all these fights, it hasn't happened. So now, here's what I'm doing if I'm any UFC light heavyweight. I'm giving Nikita Krylov my head.
Oh, wow.
I'm doing the old Kurt Angle in the match with Randy Orton, where you're like, here, put a fucking headlock on me, homeboy. Do it. And then I'm going to sweep him, take side, throw that arm underneath, that forearm underneath, put the bicep down. I remember the first time that happened, Joe. I held onto a guillotine choke on my catch wrestling coach, Brandon McSuplex, and he made my eyes practically pop out of my friggin' skull. And you know how many times I've done that since then? None, Joe. Not one. Not one. That is embarrassing. It is, and I will bitch about it until I don't see it anymore.